Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another encore session with Ellie Ragland. Hope everyone is staying warm. I know that we're getting snow all around the world, and I know that we have people from all around the world on the call tonight. I know Ellie is snowed in Missouri. We're expecting snow here in Washington, D.C. And tonight, this is an open forum discussion, so it's a little looser. This is not a lecture. What we're planning to do is just hear an excerpt of Ellie Ragland's essay called Jacques Lacan's Capitalist Discourse, which came out in Psychoanalytical Notebooks, 2008, issue 32. It's a really nice essay, and I thought it was nice. She's written so widely on Lacanian thought. She and I spoke, and we thought this would be a good selection for our group, in part because we have a number of analysts, but we also have a lot of people that come to Lacan for social and political insights as well. So one of—
It came out in 2018.
Oh, 2018, not 2008, my apologies.
Right.
We've actually talked in our group, study groups, about the discourse of capitalism multiple times. And so this is a tricky one. It's an important, it's a sort of cursed discourse, the fifth discourse, which I think Lacan never really wanted to touch or really elaborate fully, because he only mentions it just a few times. So it's really up to thinkers in the Lacanian field after Lacan to put a lot of thought to it. And one of the things I really like, and then I'll turn the floor immediately over to you, Ellie, is that in your essay, you talk about Miller's very provocative lecture on the real in the 21st century, and how the discourse of science and the discourse of capitalism have fused as the two problematic discourses of our time. And I know that many Lacanian thinkers have pinpointed this sort of undeveloped part of Lacan's teaching, the discourse of capitalism. So I'm excited to hear your excerpt and then to jump into a conversation. So without further ado, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I'll just start reading, and if you want to stop me at any point for a question or clarification, just feel free, anybody. Okay, in Jacques Lacan's psychoanalytic teaching, one encounters something quite new, the impossible to bear, the impossible to say. In his Milan discourse, he argues that one discourse, the analyst discourse, is excluded from the other three, the master, the university, and the hysteric. What the analyst discourse has in common with the capitalist discourse is that it shows the lie in such a structure. That is the capitalist discourse, the lie in it. After having said that the world is built with language and that neurosis comes from sexuality, according to Freud, Lacan wrote the capitalist discourse. One might amend this idea that neurosis comes from sexuality and say, following Lacan, that it comes from gender confusion and identification. Nonetheless, following Lacan's writing of the capitalist discourse, he says, what one says as a fact remains forgotten behind what is said and what is heard. What is said, what one says as a fact remains forgotten behind what is said and what is heard. That's a wonderful formula. For example, your brother-in-law says, we need to buy a boat. That's the American way of life. And when my brother-in-law said that to me, I had just been to India, where the rank poverty is unbelievable. I had stayed in the best university guest house and gotten sick from the dirtiness of the place and from the food. And that was from their prime place. You wonder at this person, your brother-in-law, who believes that need comes from a promised American greed. And suddenly you know that what Lacan said in 1972 is true. The capitalist discourse promises that goods will fill the lack in being. This reality does not describe the psychotic subject who has foreclosed lack from early in life and lives imprisoned in the signifiers and identifications of primordial symbiosis with the mother. but not everyone is psychotic for sure, although a lot more people are than we would think normally. They have accepted the signifier. They have accepted the signifier for sexual difference, the name of the father signifier, and have entered the social world that Lacan called the other, which he later explained did not exist except as a point or reference for a given sociocultural moment. What the capitalist discourse knows that the master discourse does not know is that material goods will satiate lack and protect one from having to deal with doubt or dissatisfaction. While the master discourse holds that the master knows what to do, say, pursue, representing the master signifier S1 in the place of an agent of speech for the other person in the place of knowledge, S2. Then I have a picture in the book of the 5 discourses. So I don't know at what point you want to put up the capitalist discourse, but it has the S, barred S on the upper left-hand side and the S2 for knowledge on the right side. And then under the master signifier, or the one for lack, is the S1. And then under the S2 is the A. But instead of having things that connect them to one another, they're arrows that go there. Okay, great. Got the capitalist discourse right there. See the arrows that go. And there's no connecting the one to the other as there are in the other 4 discourses. Okay, so this signifier is lacking in psychosis. That is the signifier for difference, and works differently in the normative social masquerade than it does in neurosis or perversion. These differential structures give meaning to diagnosis in the Lacanian analytic clinic and in reference to certain writers, artists, scientists, the psychotic group of geniuses who populate the world and of genius itself. So I'm talking about the psychotic now. And I'm not saying that psychotic is in the capitalist discourse, but I'm talking about that as one way to see the other discourses as something different. Jacques Lacan Capitalist takes seriously Lacan's notion that the capitalist discourse is one which Marx predicted as prevailing, even helped on the way to success in a real for the 21st century. Miller argues that the 21st century, following on from the 20th, has been submitted to 2 historical factors, to 2 discourses that are creating a disorder in the real, the discourse of science and the discourse of capitalism. Not only does Miller pinpoint these 2 discourses as disturbing what has been considered the regularity of nature throughout centuries, when one could count on astrological explanations for life via the alignment of the stars, or the changes of season, or the notion of sexual relationships as following traditional laws. Miller points out that one is now living in a moment when capitalism and science have joined hands to create havoc in the real, which usually remains out of sight and impossible to know. Yet it anchors being. Not only has the name of the father signifier been discounted, whether by feminism or science or capitalism, it no longer charts a path toward any regularity in science or society that can be counted upon. We are ever more isolated in our jouissance by the technological devices science gives us, as well as being ever more isolated in the notion that bigger and better goods will solve the ups and downs of the human condition. Lacan taught, however, that the name of the father was nothing more than a symptom, the symptom, the way he spelled it, Sinthome, the symptom, to fill the fundamental hole in being. Each subject has his or her unique symptoms with which to make do with his or her jouissance. The symptom can range from being satisfied in the role of mother, being happy as a teacher or scholar, being happy playing basketball, even though, of course, a lot of money can be made in that profession. So you can join the National Basketball League with capitalist greed. Whatever one's symptom, one has to make do with it, hopefully in a creative way. Nature was the name of the real when there was no disorder in the real, when the real always returned to the same place. In the 20th century, Miller says one could say that the real had the function of the other, was, in other words, a guidance of the symbolic order such that human nature could imitate the most ancient of traditions. And it is well known, for example, that the family as a natural formation served as the model for putting human groupings in order, and that the name of the father, signifier or function, was the key to the symbolized real. With the entrance of the Christian God, let us say this order remains natural. And yet today the Catholic Church fights to protect such a notion of nature and the real. But the church lost its, got a couple pages stuck together here. But the church lost its or whatever I said, I don't know, I've got to carry on from there. This conscious sphere that the church represents the field of language insofar as what is said is what one believes there is to be known. The unconscious sphere is the only one the analyst works on in the analysand's master discourse. What is repressed is that there is a lack in being in the place of truth, in hysteria, for example, which gets its idea of what there is to say from the master's belief that he or she simply knows. This is the place of the product that is made up of the interaction of the master signifier and the signifier for knowledge. The analyst's discourse is the other side of the inverse face of the master's discourse. It is the one that makes it possible to work toward change of identifications, signifiers, images, desire, through the silence of the analyst, who knows that he or she does not know what the analysand desires. The analyst's silence, interrupted only by certain sounds of compassion or surprise, etc. And finally, at the end of the session, the words are cut by the analyst when the real suffering enters the patient's words, gives a lie to the master's discourse, which one can easily align with the capitalist discourse in its certainty that it deserves good and money to make one happy. Indeed, in the place of truth, one finds the master signifier S1, which knows S2, in the place of the other that one should receive abundantly. My grandson's uncle brings him a little something every day after work. Now when the uncle forgets or chooses not to bring this little something, my grandson has a temper tantrum. He has already learned the capitalist way of life, and he is only 5. The analyst's discourse is separated from the others and is the opposite of the master's discourse. Maybe your dream is to be a rich lawyer and have a house in a glamorous suburb of Los Angeles. This was your father's dream for you as well. But perhaps you get sidetracked by falling in love with literature and wanting to teach young people to read and think critically. Maybe you decide you want to become a Lacanian psychoanalyst, one who, like the others in that community, will not charge his patients what mainstream IPA others in that community charge for having you give them your story and take medications. Indeed, Lacanians take the power of words so seriously that there's no telling your story except as an exercise in imaginary, fantasy-laden narrations. Your true story is what is impossible for you to say, impossible to bear, the real of jouissance, fantasy. And only in addressing the real and jouissance can the analyst speak beyond the discourses of the master, the university, the hysteric, and the capitalist. The analyst discourse is not a semblant, not a mask of pretense and presumption, as are the other discourses. The master discourse produces the crisis of capitalism and is indeed its substitute. What the master wants is for things to work, and better yet, to work to his good, as defined by the capitalist discourse. Indeed, Lacan called Marx's discourse a master discourse. Marx, of course, wanted things to work for justice for the proletariat. He wanted no exploitation of this particular class's time and labor. And Lacan noted that what is new to Marx is the place in which he situates work. It isn't that work is interesting. It isn't that work that is interesting, that is new in this idea of Lacan's. It is that it is bought. It's the fact that there is a labor market. But Marx, of course, did not know that it is jouissance, not capital or work, that runs the game of life. We will return to this later. We will now carry on by addressing why Lacan did not think the capitalist discourse could work in contrast to Marx, who believed that with little revolutions along the way, forms of communism would spring up as true places of fairness, equality, and sharing. Marx has been proved wrong, and Thomas Piketty in Capitalism in the 21st Century insists that he is not a Marxist and tells of his horror at being in Marxist countries where most shops were empty and people stood in long lines for a pittance of something. Lacan's point is that even though Marx was shrewd and astute, his aspirations ended up as a punctured, flat tire. He made an invention between the master signifier, which tells one what to do, and the subject who is driven by his or her own lack, the S-bar, his own desire, his own jouissance. There is no communitarian subject for Marx, only subjects that go one by one, also for Lacan, of course. The reason that capitalist discourse does not ultimately work is that it succeeds too quickly and thus constitutes itself very quickly. I think again of my grandson who wants something every day and is angry if he does not get it. It is an example of goods coming to the place of love, substituting for it, pretending to be it. But love is something that need not be expressed by goods. Indeed, we have rituals and holidays for giving so as to make a distinction between giving goods and giving love. It reminds me, this isn't in the article, but it reminds me of my grandson, who's now the one who was 5 when I wrote this, who's now 12. And he said to me, Grandma, I figured out why we have Christmas. It's not because of all the presents that you get. I was saying to him, what more do you want? What more do you want? He said, Christmas is so you can have all your family together and eat and have fun and be happy and love each other. He said, I figured that out when I was 7. What Karl Marx's theory of surplus value missed, Lacan maintains, is that the surplus in value is jouissance, not labor. Indeed, surplus value does the opposite of what Marx intended. It makes capitalism succeed. Lacan claims that Marx invented capitalism, the capitalist discourse, either in its corrupt American way or in Marx's hope for a group of the all who would be equal, ends up represented by the signifier one with the capital O. And the one is a lie. there is Lacan being, a whole at the center of the other in the body. There is no frame that would frame the frame, as Bertrand Russell taught us long ago. Moreover, Lacan claims that the analytic discourse triumphs over that of science, which is represented by more and more solipsistic gadgets. One need only think of the movie, one need only think of the movie, Her. The title of the movie is Her, where the hero falls in love with his operating system, a voice, not a person. Moreover, science has reduced itself to counting empirical data, to quantification, to a religion of numbers. And no such method one can lead to the reduction of suffering, to the good in life, to love, to sexual pleasure, to creativity, to a lack of depression or anxiety. For all its claims to have found the gene that causes autism, capitalist science misses the point. It is the impossible to know with which psychoanalysis deals. What produces a social bond is not the sharing of material goods, nor even the gift of free time. I'm reading all this when I can't live without my phone. So, I mean, we are a product of our culture. What produces a social bond is not the sharing of material goods, nor even the gift of free time, but is found in the order of what is produced by language in relation to the other as other. The other seen in terms of his or her own particular desire. Lacan argued that the master makes the social bond, even if it is in his or her arguing politics in a barroom brawl. The university discourse makes the social bond by seducing the student into believing what one has to teach is what the student desires to learn. The hysteric makes the social bond by reaching out to a master who will give her status and being, until she subverts him or her with another question, another turn toward a better master. These discourses, unlike the psychoanalytic one, do not lead a person to the point of reconfiguring his or her identifications, as happens in analysis, but they do make a social bond. And the psychotic, even though he or she is not in language, does not make a social bond. This is one reason Lacan would not include it with the four others. Neither does the capitalist whose fix feeds itself and which has, as Lacan says, become self-consuming. Yet Lacan says that even with all the effects of the signifier, a little part escapes the subject. That is what he calls surplus jouissance, desire and its cause, its fantasies, its drives. The subject is not filled by material goods, but by that which drives its jouissance, its passion, be it to be isolated as a monk, copying manuscripts in the name of the rose, or as Bill Gates, who certainly works more than 8 hours a day because his passion lies in his creating. The money for him is a byproduct, not a cause. So the S part is filled by the object A that brings jouissance, and it is not filled once and for all, but can be filled creatively, not destructively, as by drugs or alcohol or the goods produced by capitalism. In Radiophonie, given 2 years before the Milan Discourse, the one we're talking about now, Lacan answers 7 questions posed by a student in Belgium. His answer is destined to be aired on Belgian radio in 1970. He maintains that not only did Marx's theory of surplus value lead to the capitalist discourse, but it has also precipitated the notion of class. Well, I don't know. Okay, fine. There's many different ways of thinking of class. But Marx particularly did that too, Lacan thinks. Freud, says Lacan, is the true revolutionary because he discovered the unconscious, which comes from a point of lack. and the unconscious works dialectically via the Freudian laws of condensation and displacement, which Lacan reconfigured using Roman Jakobson's metaphor and metonymy, showing how they give a dynamic movement to conscious knowledge. Marx could not knock down the walls of Jericho, Lacan claimed, because he did not know that jouissance is primary. Marx, with his surplus value that functions as this scissors with which he tailors his cloth, restores to the capitalist discourse the price one was put on denying, as does Lacan, that any discourse can be appeased by a meta-language, be it formalist, Hegelian, or whatever. But Marx paid this price by compelling himself to follow the naive discourse of the capitalist to its zenith and the life in hell it creates. But this does not make sense unless one understands that what Lacan means by surplus jouissance. Marx's symptom, the seashell Marx listened to, is in the converse shell, the cowrie shell, which the Argonauts traded on a less perfect ocean, that of capitalist production. This shell whispers surplus, whereas the cause of a desire whose economy makes its principle that of extensive production, thus one of insatiability, of a lack in jouissance. It is the name of capital. It expands consumption, on the other hand, without which production would be accomplished in vain, precisely because of the inability to procure a jouissance that would let it slow down. This revolution of production, says Lacan, is a seduction whose primary aim is to make one spend one's jouissance. But the excess in jouissance, the surplus, while it makes the machine turn, gives a way to fill up a hole. It makes his inaugural cut. Marx redoubles himself to gather up what fails from the cloth he has cut. Lacan calls Marx's surplus value Mehrlust, more pleasure, his own surplus jouissance, which goes unfortunately into repetition and its symptoms. While Marx calculated the place of a black hearth, he also calculated the capitalist whose concern with excess jouissance means that revolution will be assured as favorable to making its own desire difficult to endure. The result is that the exploited must rival the exploitation of principle to shelter themselves from that participation in the thirst of lack and enjoying. While Marx starts off with the function of the market, his codification is of an excess in value, which articulates the renunciation of jouissance and opens not onto the essence of the analytic discourse, which is the function of surplus jouissance, as the symptom that keeps you from moving forward in your desire and jouissance. Freud discovered the orientation toward the symptom and beyond the pleasure principle, where he says that the most thorough treatment of symptoms, their having been understood, fought against, etc., still ended in the impasse of the patient's ability to do anything but repeat them. At this point in 1920, Freud decided that life was not governed by the pleasure principle, but by thanatos, the death drive, the drive toward death in the sense of repeating that which does not wish one's own good. Now, nor, Lacan argues, are the means of production put at the service of pleasure. Rather, capital itself is augmented by reinvestment. It makes itself the symptom which would fill its own life. This is something like the conclusion drawn by Thomas Piketty that inherited wealth just keeps accumulating and will constitute itself only as accumulation if it does not already. A global capitalism accumulating, run by the top 1% of oligarchs. It is not surprising that Lacan named one of the four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis repetition, and repetition is inseparable from the symptom which governs life by jouissance, by references to the way the name of the Father signifier binds together the Borromean knot. Even in the Middle Ages, when excommunication and witch burning were common in the fight to separate essence from nominalism. Today, the church still fights hard against science, although one can only say that the church has succumbed to the discourse of capitalism. After all, God rewards his soldiers. The thirst for profit, for gain, is not absent from the Catholic Church or from the Protestant denominations. Hinduism promotes the quest for money for its priests, as do other world religions. Science enters the game of capitalism by allowing prediction insofar as it supposedly demonstrates the existence of laws. Empiricism, with its religion of numbers, thinks to reduce all knowledge of the human condition to empirically verifiable data. And indeed, despite Einstein's warnings, physics has had to make up a way for uncertainty, for chance. It has even had to make allowances for the possibility that Einstein's theory of gravity is wrong. Lacan had already said that the real itself is without law. Now, with the change of any way of writing laws that speak in the real, one can decidedly sever the connection between nature and the real. As science brings bioengineering and eugenics to capital, Miller says we would do well to remember Marx's words in his Communist Manifesto. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without the condition of incessant revolution of the instruments of production, and thereby of the relations of production, and with them all social relations. There is an incessant disturbance of all social conditions, constant uncertainty and agitation. All fixed and ossified relations with their train of beliefs and ideas venerated for centuries are swept away. The clearest break with tradition, Miller says. All that is solid vanishes into the air. Everything sacred is profane. Capitalism and science have combined to make nature disappear, Miller says. And what is left over is disordered, a remainder, with no ideals of harmony left except for those romantics who still believe the sexual relationship is about oneness and that God will bring wholeness to the human soul. At one time, Lacan taught that the unconscious was the knowledge and the real, structured like a language. And in that period, he sought laws, the laws of speech, the structure of recognition a la Hegel, the laws of the signifier, the relation of cause and effect between signifier and signified in metaphor and metonymy. He ordered this knowledge in graphs under the law of the name of the Father in the clinic by phallic ordering of the libido. But he also opened another realm with his idea of la langue. Each language is formed by contingency, by chance. In this sense, Freud's unconscious appears to be an elucubration of knowledge about the real. What interprets, said Lacan, is not the analyst, but each person's unconscious. And what does it interpret? At the point of the past and analysis, one encounters the effects of la langue. That's taking the word language, and making it into one word, la langue. And I mean, it's not a word that exists before Lacan. And the effects of jouissance on the body. These come out of the pure shock of the drive. The real is neither a cosmos nor a world. It is also not an order. It is a piece, an asystematic fragment separated from the fictional knowledge that was produced from the encounter of the analyst with his or her unconscious. Thus, the real as invented by Lacan is not one of science, but one of contingency and randomness, starting off from the early knowledge that there is no rapport of oneness between the sexes. There is not an a priori knowledge or innate structure. There's only what comes afterwards, knowledge of the fantasy of one's supposition of what the analyst knows and of psychoanalysis itself. Thus, psychoanalysis takes place at the level of the repressed, and its interpretation, thanks to the analyst, who sits at it as the subject supposed to know. As the 21st century psychoanalysis explores one's defenses against the real with law or meaning, Lacan invented a way of representing the real with the Borromean knot. At the end of an experience, of an exploration of its topology, one finds an absolute absence of charity, fraternity, or human sentiment. The time finds an absolute sentiment. This is where the search for the real, stripped of meaning, leads. We are left not with the truth of the fantasy, but with that of the Santon, where we may have the luck to pass beyond his or her fundamental fantasy and confront the life that is filled by his opaque jouissance, which is itself the reiteration of the traumatic incidence of language on the body. One sees why Miller takes, like Lacan, has no faith either in capital or in pseudoscientisms that mark today's psychiatric and psychological clinics with their appeals to number, to computer code, statistics, sociobiology. Semblance are taken at face value in game theory, gene theory, brain theory, in ways to decode the truths of ordinary language. There is no thought that these very sciences veil the deadly symptom that is attached to some jouissance whose impossibility to say itself can never reach the realm of her contingency of the impossible to bear, where something of the real can be heard and rewritten. Lacan argues that language makes us sick animals, and that it brings both pain and jouissance, a mixture of pleasure and despair. It is neither the real of sexuality nor some Kantian transcendental, nor is it whole. For all that, both Lacan and Miller believe that psychoanalysis is in the forefront of meaning-making with the new categories of the imaginary, symbolic, and the Santon, the real and the Santon. Philosophy is old, Lacan said, except for Heidegger. He liked Heidegger a lot. And while science undoubtedly makes technological advances, psychoanalysis offers a new kind of discourse, Miller says, to the future of myoplasma laboratorium. It's some article that in analysis one can use the symbolic to undo the knots in the real. Traditionalists, meanwhile, want to stop both science and psychoanalysis as early as civilization and its discontents. This is the last page, okay? As early as civilization and its discontents, Freud spoke of the death drive. This is a far cry from Thomas Piketty's notion that things will be all right. There will be justice and fairness. There will be no more jouissance to attach itself to the rich or poor, as long as we have a progressive income tax on the upper 1% of the oligarchs of inherited wealth. Piketty's book is beyond impressive, but it is utopian. He is no more aware of jouissance and its lethal effects than was Marx. Economic scientists like Piketty and others have simply replaced the idea that God wills that such and such will be so by the expression they say, meaning the new doctors of knowledge, scientists. And as I'm reading this, I'm thinking, but what would we do without the scientists who are trying to help us now with COVID-19? In any case, I'm making a point. Indeed, under today's reign of the number, one can see that Lacan's teaching is not a correspondence theory of knowledge. As such, it is a move away from the imaginary to the real, which is itself an impasse in formalization. When one moves from a theory of infinity to a theory of God, Lacanian typology subtracts the imaginary from the symbolic and enables the real to emerge as an impasse. Meanwhile, infinity persists as an effect of the signifier, while mathematics is equivalent to a science of the real. Democracy is but a political semblant which plugs the hole in being when anxiety raises its head. Meanwhile, Lacanian analysis aims for the feminine logic of the not all under one dictate of the master discourse, not all one. In 1776, Adam Smith claimed that the wealth of the nations was the equivalent of the labor of the population. He referred to the great body of the people as a body politic, a social body. He argued his theory as an empirical social fact, which was also a positivistic statistical fact. Scientific knowledge, then, equals measurement and calculation. Observation becomes a tool in this positivism, while language is transparent to reality. Number becomes a calculable figure written in a concise style. A statistical way of reading functions as a kind of seeing. The process is something like speaking a language without realizing its grammatical rules. Not surprisingly, the director of the Institute of Statistics at the University of Michigan argues that one can prove anything with statistics, the outcome depending on the language put forth and the subjectivity of the researcher, anchored as it is in the real. Lacan would say things like, the doctor knows what is the desire of the doctor. Here we have gone from Lacan's dismantling of Marx's notion of surplus value and his utopian type of communist revolutions to Miller's argument that capitalism has joined hands with science to place a profound disorder in the real, and to the idea that number itself plays a nefarious role in the efforts psychoanalysis makes to work with the real of the symptom and jouissance in order to give a bit more freedom and creativity to their patients, working by a logic of one by one. Through.
Right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That was rich. You've given us a lot to ponder. I know there's a number of questions, but since I'm the host, I will be selfish. And if it's all right, I'd like to begin the Q&A, Ellie. So a couple things here. I am sympathetic to your suggestion that Lacan was critical of Marx in the ways that you outlined. However, at the same time, we must realize that this is a biographical point, and also a theoretical one, but which is that upon his expulsion from the IPA, you know where he found his teaching home, right? It was with the Marxists. Yeah, it was with Louis Althusser, right? And it was a new audience that opened up to him, and it was at that time where he really started to study Marx. And I would simply say, I think that you're right around this notion of proletariat, but the reason Marx is the inventor of the capitalist discourse and what's unique about it in relation to the other four is that it doesn't produce a social link, okay?
Right.
So structurally, he can prove this through the math themes, but Marx could prove it from the standpoint of a very unique form of universalism, which is founded on its exclusion. It's like an excluded universalism, which is the place or the non-place of the proletariat. Through their exclusion, they inhabit the A in some sense. So that's number one. Number two, I don't think that Marx is a utopian thinker. I mean, it's well known that he's not. He was an adamant critic of the utopian socialist project. So we cannot really speak of utopianism within Marx until the later 20th century Marxists like Ernst Bloch and others. And therefore, Marxism sees itself, and here, I think very important, in the later Marx, which Lacan didn't read, the Grundrisse, which is Marx's commentary on post-industrial capitalism, i.e. finance capitalism. He presents a theory of what's called the social individual, i.e. he presents a theory of radical, the subject, qua individual. So I really don't see Marxism as a communitarian theory of the subject. And I think that if Lacan said that, he was criticizing it from a vulgar Marxist standpoint, or rather criticizing a sense of Marxism from the 19th century, which would hold the notion that a community of proletarian excludeds would somehow seize a revolutionary moment. This is not true, even in the Bolshevik Revolution. It didn't really function in this kind of symmetrical wholeness, right? I mean, the Bolshevik assemblage was an absolute cross-class alliance, and it was a completely different strategic success. We should not think of Marx as a communitarian populist, is what I'm trying to say. That's point number two. Then these are some more theoretical things I think we should all chew on. First of all, I'd love your thoughts, and we've talked about this before, and I know many others have thoughts on this. Why does Lacan say that the Discourse of Capital treats castration in the way that it does? Why is castration structurally avoided? That's a very interesting point. I think it has to do with the relationship between the S1 and the S2, because the S1 is in a position of truth, which is the market, and the S2 is the commodity. It starts with the divided subject, and its production is the A. But there's no real dialectical mediation for the subject's split subjectivity other than the A. That's all that they're given. There's no other mediation. So therefore, that's the reason there. But then all of the effects on the subject qua sexuality. And here I'm thinking of all of the gender expressions of our own time, and the predominance of the Discourse of Capital is very central to that as well. So I wanted to see what you think about this thesis of castration. And because he says something that the surplus jouissance disturbs, or rather gets rid of sex. Gets rid of sex. And I wonder if you think that getting rid of sex is related to castration, and if you agree, how does that work in your view? Like,
well, Lacan does say, I'll go back to your other points first, but Lacan does say over and over again that because there is no sexual rapport of oneness, there's nothing but sexual relatings all the time. I mean, the fact that there is no absolute oneness of the perfect harmony of the sexes, then there is going to be nothing but the effort to make that harmony. So it makes us very sexual creatures. So I know in the beginning when I thought he meant that was getting rid of sex, I thought, well, I mean, goodness, you go to Paris when Lacan was still living. You go to a dinner party and all the women would have some kind of beautiful blouse on, no bra, just showing their breasts. Very much 60s type of sexual revolution at Saint-Denis, not Saint-Denis, but the other one. So when you talk about castration, what I understand him to mean there is that there is the Lacan being that everybody has, except the psychotic who doesn't really experience it in the same way. That because of the Lacan being, which is the key to the social, it's the key to being, you have to have a Lacan being, or else you have a horror, you have autism, you have psychosis, you have a horrible life. So most people are castrated in that sense. They have a lack in being. They know that they're not all whole. They know that there's doubt, uncertainty. And so they're, of course, going to make some effort, given their cultural moment, to fill the lack in being with what's around. I mean, in the ancient Greek times, it was with truth and knowledge. And, today, it's obviously, well, with capitalism, it's obviously with goods. You do not admire the most the one who knows something. And Lacan thinks that psychoanalysts and psychiatrists don't really understand that either, that they're still working with sociobiology now as an advance of studying the suffering by the brain. But I'm not sure I'm answering your question. I would say to what you said in the beginning about Marx, that I haven't read Marx. I don't know Marx. And at one point I said to one of my friends in Paris, Lacan wasn't really a Marxist. He didn't really know Marx. He hadn't really read Marx, had he? And she said, no, but all his pupils had. I mean, all that early group that he took away from the Sorbonne, Jacques Lacan, Colette Solaire, Eric Laurent, all of them. Althusser followed him and tried to make some theories based on Lacan, tried very hard, although they were problematic and they were wrong. But nonetheless, he really tried. He wasn't mad at Lacan, like some of them, like Deleuze and Guattari. So, I think Elizabeth is right that Lacan didn't really know Marx. But I think even if he had read Marx, he would probably still come up with the same idea. But I don't know. That I can't answer. Because when you say, I mean, it's clear that you have a very close reading of Marx, and that you can see why when I wrote this article for a volume of several Croatian politicos who were also interested in psychoanalysis, they were horrified by what I said against Marx and sent me the article back too sweet. But
It's okay. We won't call you a bourgeois reformer on this. Maybe in future meetings, it depends. But okay, well, that's very helpful. In fact, I think that the other interesting thing, and you don't have to answer this, I'll just say it as a comment. It's real interesting to consider the efficacy of psychoanalysis as a practice in society in a context of a hyper-capitalist discourse, because it's here that psychoanalysis's efficacy wanes, and Lacan was aware of that. That's why he was terrified of the discourse of capitalism, because it would come to usurp the master's discourse and get rid of the discourse of the analyst in the same step.
right.
The other interesting thing that Miller points out is that Stalinism and really existing socialism and so on, Miller says, I don't know if you knew this, it was not the discourse of capitalism, it was not some new thing, it was actually the discourse of the university. If you really want to understand totalitarianism, you actually need to turn to the discourse of the university.
I agree with that. I didn't know he'd said it, but I couldn't agree with it more.
Yeah. So, and of course, all of that is not an endorsement of Marxism per se. Marxism is a kind of a philosophy which seeks to confront capitalist life and capitalist realities, but it's not a philosophy of a vulgar playbook or handbook for how to transition out of capitalism per se, although there are hints to it there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, I will turn it over. Put your hand up, like the hand feature might be a good solution.
I wanted to say just one more thing about Miller and capitalism. When he first read Marx, this is long before he met Lacan, when he finished reading Marx, he said, Marx is true because he's right. Marx is true because he's right. They had a Marxist journal, Marx and Lacan, that was published for a while in Paris. But
I don't want to deride Miller too much, but he is an interesting figure today, politically speaking, because
yes,
he himself saw the two right-wing and left-wing movements in France, the Front National and the populist left-wing, not Marxist, but left-wing populist Mélenchon. He saw those as possible existential threats to the clinic if they were to seize power. And I really felt like that was a very conservative reading. And I think that there's a conservatism there around something around the yes, like keeping the deleterious effects of the capitalist discourse at bay. So then, and what that means is that as a psychoanalyst, do you effectively have to adopt a position of capitalist realism or a kind of mild reformism? That to me is a very uncourageous position to inhabit.
they feel like they're doing a non-capitalist thing in that they charge so little. I mean, if you go to somebody like Leclerc or La Planche, downtown Paris, they charge, 300 euros per session, while Miller's charging 50 euros per session. But the point about money and goods is that the one thing you find when you hang out with a group of those psychoanalysts in the Lacanian field, they're all very rich. They tend to be very Jewish and very rich.
Okay, let's open it up. I know many folks here have thought about this material a lot and even have written about it. We have some very, I know Duane is here and Macario and Frank Smecker and Rosemary. So I invite you all to jump in. I know that Cade has a comment that he's written out. You can also read that if you'd like. Cade, go ahead. Just take yourself off mute.
Yeah, sure. Thank you again for the presentation. I guess one question that came to mind throughout reading the paper and the talk was something along the lines of, if the capitalist discourse, if that produces its own diagnostic category, like at the same level of like psychosis or neurosis, with that, could you say Lacan would be able to diagnose someone as capitalist, or would it still be like a secondary phenomenon? And kind of a second part with that and the similarities between the capitalist discourse and the repetitions of the symptom within the death drive. I was wondering if the move from symptom to symptom, if that could be considered something like a domestication of the symptom, and if there's something that of the symptoms repetitions, and if there's something similar that could be done with the repetitions of the capitalist discourse or the capitalist subject. Like, is there any idea of a symptom applied to the capitalist discourse, what that would look like, or if there's any proto examples that people have isolated or anything?
Well, when Lacan moves to, in seminar 23 on James Joyce, when he moves to a Borromean discourse, he gets rid of the name of the father. I mean, not that it's not also still a necessary thing when you're a baby and you need a third term to make the mother and the infant know they're not one. And the father figure or whoever serves as a third person in that structure is the one who introduces lack and makes lack a really big thing. But the last part that you were saying, yeah, now tell me again what you were saying at the end.
That like that the
About the symptom. I started to say that how Lacan, when he got to seminar 23, he changed from using the name of the father function to the word symptom, a medieval spelling of the word symptom. And he argued that the Santome was what knotted all of the orders together, the real, the symbolic, the imaginary, and then the Santome was the knot. And it functions differently, like for instance, in adolescence and puberty, the knots of the laws given by the name of the father, or the one who gives the sense of how you're supposed to be in a culture. The knots loosen. I mean, puberty onset, the power of the peer pressure. I mean, the knots loosen. And in hysteria, that's part of the problem of the hysteric. She doesn't know, am I a woman, am I a man? So she's always having the law that really serves most people who seem completely happy and who have made a life of, oneness, kind of wholeness. They're people for whom the law is very tight, and it doesn't, very tight. My sister, who's very conservative, said to me at one point, I know you like wine with dinner every night, but I think you'd be better off if you just had one glass of wine at Valentine's Day and one on Christmas. And I was kind of shocked, because it just seemed so amazing to me that she would say that. It's really, the symptom also plays its role in psychosis, in that in psychosis there is the imaginary, the good enough imaginary father. And when that breaks, when the relation with that good enough imaginary father breaks, then the psychotic has the risk of having a complete delusory breakdown. But there's the compensatory illusory father, and that is part of the Santome. That's taking place of the fact that the psychotic didn't completely get castrated, take on lack in being when he was growing up. But he's not so troubled that there isn't some kind of imaginary father that he takes on. I know a schizophrenic man that I used to know, very brilliant man, speaks 20 languages, has written as many books. But the male that he admired was this person from whom he learned Russian, but it was a little retarded man, completely retarded. I mean, the most he could do in a social discourse is to say, "You're the heart of me bottom." Talk like that all the time. Talk about peeing, and very retarded. But this was the compensatory imaginary father for this schizophrenic man, because he wanted to learn Russian, and that's how he got to know him. But then he took him on as that kind of figure in his life. Another such figure, not quite as bad, that ran his home in England. He had a castle, and with people boarding there. So once Lacan starts talking to Borromean discourse, and no longer the discourse of meaning, one has to really work a lot with Santome and how he says that Joyce's Santome was what he was able to do even materially with language, like just chew on it and make it really visceral kind of thing. And that it kept him from having a full-out psychotic break, which his daughter had when she was in her early 20s, but he didn't ever have a full-out break. Although some Lacanians will say, well, what do you think Finnegan's Wake is if it's not a full-out break? You don't say that to a Joyce scholar.
Peter, would you jump in with your question, please?
Sure. Hello, Ellie. It's Peter Dobie. Very nice to see
Oh,
you.
Peter, how nice to see you.
I'm very glad to hear you talk. It was hard for me to follow the sort of capitalist stuff, but there were a couple of notes on psychosis that I kind of want to pick you on. You sort of alluded to it at points, and
Yes.
I'd assume you'd kind of agree that in some ways the psychotic is more free, unless he's stuck. But there was sometimes you were, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I inferred that a psychotic structure is somewhat protected from the vicissitudes of capital and society. And of course, we know this with withdrawing schizophrenics and so forth. But I would say that what we see today, at least I think so, with what we call an ordinary psychotic, is that they identify all the time, and that they absolutely need the other for verification, for validity, and in some ways they're really stuck to a rigid identity bond.
This is because they didn't drop, they stayed in that symbiotic bond with the primordial mother, with the early first person who played the role of mother. And so they are absolutely require another. You could say that maybe they're a little bit freer in that they don't have such a attachment to the law, but that in itself makes them have problems all the time, because they get in trouble with people by saying the wrong thing, by bringing a butcher knife to a faculty meeting where things are, it costs them a lot not having the law. And I would say absolutely what you said is 100% true and describes psychotics.
I don't know if you saw it, Ellie, but Dwayne had made a comment in the chat. He had asked about, at some point you said, there is no communitarian subject, only subjects that go one by one. I had assumed you were just sort of making a claim about the sort of irreducible jouissance that escapes, identification and groupthink, but maybe you were making a claim about psychosis. I'm not sure. And I'm rude for sort of re-asking question there, but.
Well, the no communitarian is simply what Lacan means by that is simply that that's no more a solution to the Lacan being than is capitalism. And so because that's not a solution,
don't you think one of the big problems with our ordinary psychotic subjects today is that they find very easily a psychotic solution, a remedy in capitalism, but it's always failing. I mean, it's why they're miserable, and on the surface level, it looks as if they're neurotics. Does this sound at all? I mean, it's a crazy way of putting it, but it might make sense from a sort of topological standpoint. Couldn't we say capitalism is psychotic in a sense? How do you respond to that? I would say yes, in that it doesn't repress. And
well, I mean, there is something to that. I mean, capitalism, I mean, it so lacks the human quality, which all the other four discourses have, no matter how he critiques them. The other four discourses make a social link. That's his definition of discourse, what makes a social link. And capitalism doesn't make a social link. I mean, that's not its goal. I mean, its goal may be to have a phone like to have a telephone like your best buddy at school, or to imitate other people. You could say it makes a social link, but its goal is not to make a social link.
Right, we get really attached to capitalism, and yet it's alienating. It seeds up the social bond.
That's right.
Is that, what I mean? I think it would always fail, especially as someone who grew up in a commune that, of course, I feel like that's why a commune could never work within. Ellie, could a commune ever work within capitalism? Then I'll shut up.
Well, I mean, why wouldn't it work as well as marriages? I mean, you know, a big typical, you know, bride and groom and little babies in the bourgeois household.
Marriages work because they don't cross the incest taboo, but I feel like communes try to do that.
Oh, I see. I hear you. Okay. Well, I don't think a commune can work any better than any other of our efforts. All of our efforts, that's Lacan's point. They're all doomed to failure. And what everybody needs, this is his point, if they're going to get any help at all in this sick game of life, is psychoanalysis. So, I mean, you could say, you know, nana, nana, boo, boo. So now you come in with your solution. But what he's saying is that it's the only one that takes account of jouissance, desire, lack, all kinds of things that are not the Borromean structure, all kinds of things that are not accounted for by other theories.
But would you agree that a successful psychotic can escape the problems with the capitalist discourse or use it very well? I want to say that maybe a psychotic can form a commune of one.
Well, the beautiful mind.
Yeah.
John Nash, I mean, that's an example of someone who succeeded despite being very psychotic. I don't know if you've seen the movie Beautiful Mind, but he suffered unbelievably. I mean, that's my of the psychotics I've known, and I've known quite a few. Yes, that may work very well for them. They may be very successful, but they suffer incredibly. This is why I always tell my students when we're reading somebody who is clearly psychotic, or, you know, some poet or somebody who's psychotic, I always say, you know, you don't have to think of them as a genius who God came down and pressed his thumb on their head and said, you will be a genius. There's somebody who suffers terribly, and out of that comes the creativity.
And in a way, a harder suffering because they don't get off on their symptoms in the same way as a neurotic.
Right.
More of a harsh suffering.
Put. Very well put.
Okay, so I want to turn to Robert and then Chaim. So
Okay.
Robert first, please jump in.
Hi, Ellie. Thank you so much for your talk. I put this version of this question in the chat if you can see it, but I'm trying to map out different readings of the discourse of the capitalist. So Stein Van Oel has a piece where he talks about the use of the discourse of the capitalist as almost something that kind of works too well. That is a description of consumer culture. So that is part of the danger, is that there is no sort of break within the kind of figure eight that the discourse of the capitalist offers. At the same time, you have like Pierre Bruno, where he talks about this is not about this sort of like capitalist ideology, but is rather about the sort of social link. It describes as a solution. There's a social link that engenders surplus value, the extraction of surplus value. And I can't help but think that there's seemingly a contradiction between these things, whereas like circuits of desire may have no innate break, but the extraction of surplus value, if Marx theorizes in the Grundrisse and in Capital, that this is someplace where breaks occur, that I want to see where you kind of fall on this. So whether the discourse of the capitalist is a kind of description of consumer culture, or if it bears some mark to the sort of hidden abode of production that Marx describes, and whether that distinction is worth making for you, and where you kind of come down on that, if you do have a sort of position on it. Thank you.
Well, I know both Stein and Pierre, and I respect their works very much. I really would respect Stein's. Pierre Bruno was one of the ones who wrote in that journal on Marx and Lacan when that journal was coming out. I can say for the first part of your question that its goal is to fill the lack with goods. So it's a consumerism, and that's supposed to be the answer to unhappiness or sorrow, suffering of any kind. Supposedly you're continually getting better at having goods, and that's supposed to solve it. The other point of view, I don't know. I can't answer it because your question was too sophisticated for me. Because that would be the one thing I would be afraid of reading this before your group tonight, because I don't know Marx, and I only know what Lacan said about Marx. Is that?
I mean, I think Samo Tomczyk also in his book on Marx and Lacan will argue that the consumerist reading is actually inadequate, and that what Lacan was really finding in Marx was a productive theory of the unconscious.
Right.
And so Marx opens that possibility up, and I think there's even a lot of resonance and dialogue with what Deleuze and Guattari would say about the productivity of the unconscious, albeit they would flip all the Lacanian categories on their head in Anti-Oedipus. But even though I'm unfamiliar with Bruno, is it? Pierre Bruno?
Yeah,
I'm
Bruno.
familiar with that particular piece, but this is definitely, Robert, something that has plagued me too when looking at this question, because if the answer is that really if this is a commentary on the subject qua consumer, that doesn't really strike me as that interesting, right?
That's kind of where I was, where I was thinking in
Yeah.
the same direction.
Well, it's not, and he's bringing together that subject, the consumer and the use of science as the two kind of universal discourses that reign in culture today, to try to say, how should you live your life? What's going to give you your good? And so he puts together both science and capitalism and thinks they've come together to draw the lines and figure out the answers to that. But I think unless you sort of know more about what he thinks about science and what he said about science, it's hard to understand that the capitalist discourse is very much a conglomeration of those two things. I mean, it's not that you have science separate from capitalism, that the two have become one in Lacan's way of understanding it. I mean, it's just a simple thing to say, oh, you want a basketball for Christmas and then you'll be happy and oh, blah, blah, blah. I mean, that would be, I think, far too simplistic, but it's, well, I mean, if you see his waiting room, Jacques Lacan's waiting room, which is where Lacan used to have a waiting room, it's full of very, very, very wealthy people, and they're not happy. So there's something missing there, and they're in analysis, trying to find a solution. It's so interesting what people do with capital. I mean, I'm always so fascinated by my sister, because she thinks if she has the next, fancy top to her counters, that she'll be fine, and always the next good. And I have this problem with money, that I don't like to shop, and I don't like I don't want to spend it, and I don't want to save it. I just don't want to use it. I know it's there, but I don't do anything about it. I have more the idea of, well, whatever I've managed to get together in my life, I'll give to my daughter, which is, I guess, the way a lot of people think about money too.
Sounds like a very Puritan unconscious.
Yes, a very Puritan unconscious. It's my father, the minister.
Yes. Okay. Robert, that's really excellent. Kayam, are you, I don't know where you went. I know you have a question, no?
Yeah, I'm here. Hi, Ellie.
Hi.
Nice to be back with you. Thank you for coming to give your talk. I enjoyed it. I heard you talk, you mentioned Joyce, and I wasn't going to say anything, but you threw in the offhand remark about how the Joyce scholars would not appreciate, the way that Lacanians handled Joyce, and Colette Solaire says something similar about what's his name, Pessoa.
Mhm.
And you made another comment that Nana Boo Boo, you're claiming that you got. So in other words, what do we do with artists? I have a sense that a lot of analysts are trawling the same waters, so to speak, as the artists, and so maybe there's some intimidation or a threat.
Well, Lacan
But
took the point about artists that Freud did. He took the point of view that the artist was always ahead of the psychoanalyst. They knew about the real. They knew about jouissance. They knew about the truths of those parts of those ways of being, those parts of being. And so that they were always in advance of the psychoanalysts. I was just reading about that in a book that Tom Sobolos just wrote. And he was talking again about how the degree to which Lacan admired artists. At the same time, he would say the same thing about anybody that's suffering, I mean, he was Picasso's analyst. He was particularly the analyst of all of Picasso's women. Once he dumped them, they ended up in Lacan's office.
well, I guess my question is about the nature of the real. Are there an infinite variety, or is there only one? Because if you want, this is really a metaphysics question. If you want to say that there's a function being filled outside of the clinic for artists, and then maybe for others as well. So then what are we talking about when we talk about the real?
Well, there are several reals. Everybody uses that, the impossible to say, the impossible to bear, but there are many reals. There can be a reel connected with I don't know how you prepare your meals, a real how you feel about cooking. I know my mother never let me cook. She always made me go and play the piano and do my homework, and I suffer because of that, because I'm not like just a woman who's going to the kitchen. If I do, it's onerous for me. So that the whole oral drive, that whole area for me is part of the real where there's problems. There are plenty of other two things that are in the real that I know of for myself that I work with. So everybody has many reels of the real.
But if you're trying to say, I don't know if I'm going to formulate this, if you're trying to say that someone like Joyce was a psychotic, it's really just something that came from romanticism, the fantasy of the troubled artist and the drug-addled poet like Coleridge, and
He did,
and
Lacan did say that, in his seminar of 23, he says, was Joyce crazy? Était-il fou? And he said, yes, he was crazy. He had the structure of psychosis, the poverty of the father's name, constantly fleeing Ireland, going to all these other countries, fleeing the motherland, the mother tongue. And for a long time, we were very careful about that, about saying that Joyce was psychotic, because that's not something that would make Joyce scholars very happy. I used to always get invited to speak about Joyce to their international meetings. And one time I let it slip that Lacanians thought that, his brilliance and that his symptom really was that of psychosis. And they never invited me back. They didn't want to hear that.
Yeah, but Ellie, don't they miss the point? The scholars that get offended that it's that Joyce was essentially a psychotic structure that was kept from going florid because of his writing. He actually appeases both sides, because it's not saying that it's a product of his psychosis. It's saying that his writing kept him from going, strictly speaking, psychotic.
I really think that the more one learns about psychosis, the way they're working with it in the Freudian field now, the less of a negative stigma there's going to be because, you know, I mean, my gosh,
It's everywhere.
if all it's everywhere. With ordinary psychosis.
Okay. But the question is, the question, the operative question is, what are the implications for taking the work of analysis out of the clinic into the world? If we see that, because it is not only Joyce, of course. What is it then? And if it isn't only an analysis that is being done,
Well, they have a new category on my email now. Lacan goes to the theater with such and such a playwright, or psychoanalysis goes to mathematicians with such and such a mathematician. Lacan, of course, because of his interest in language, was immediately picked up by literary departments. And so there's no accident that he studied in literature departments, and not just Joyce, but by many poets, many artists. But he's the only one that he commented on. Joyce is the only one he commented on to that degree. So that's why I think it comes out so much.
okay,
It would
maybe
like
you.
working with the symptom and not psychoanalysis in the traditional sense. I mean, that's what I do. If you don't work with the unconscious, you work with the symptom.
Right, exactly. It's in studying Joyce that he gave the word symptom its presence and its ordering, or structural ordering.
What I'm trying to get across is that if so, then this is something that could be done by a coal miner or housewife.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
You could, absolutely.
Yeah, they have their solution.
Okay, so I want to check in. It's been an hour and a half. I want to make sure. Ellie, are you tired? Would you like to conclude, or would you have time for maybe a couple more?
I have time for a couple more.
Okay. So for all of you that have sat on your hands, now is the time to jump and to feel free. I feel the urge to call on people. People for whom I know they have many nice things to contribute. I wonder if some of the people that practice psychoanalysis put a lot of thought to Lacan's teaching on the Discourse of the Capitalist. Is it something that you think about a lot when you're seeing your analysts, or is it something that's not? Is it something that's more of kind of a mystery, or sort of something marginal?
It's more marginal.
Why?
It's not something. Well, I think because for Lacan, it was such an obvious kind of simplistic kind of solution to suffering that he didn't make it a social link. In the master discourse, the S1 is everything he knows or she knows they think is right, and they attach themselves to the other person at the level of knowledge, meaning what I know is what you should know because I know it all. That makes a social link. That's Lacan's point. Barroom brawl makes a social link. The hysteric may want to subvert the master that she's running after, but at least running after the master makes the social link. And I guess it's in a way, it's the personlessness of capitalism. I mean, it's not person per se that you're pursuing. It's goods.
Well, that, and I think Lacanian psychoanalysis in the States, because it's not covered by health insurance, has a class dimension of classes, and I think it's unfortunate for analysts because it's likely the case that there's very few Trump supporters that come to the couch, for example.
Right.
And that's
right.
unfortunate in some
That's
sense,
unfortunate.
because you're depriving yourself of a full sense of the social picture, right?
Right.
And so it kind of is reproducing a kind of safe space or something. I don't know. I don't know if that's fair, or if you.
No, I think it's fair.
Um,
I mean, it is too bad. It's really culturally predetermined.
well, you saw this article in the New York Times today, which Emmanuel Macron is critical of American academics in woke culture. I'm sure you're familiar with woke culture.
Yes.
He thinks that it presents its influence on French intellectual life presents a huge danger to the universalism of the French Republic.
Well, I can understand that because there's so Europeans. I mean, if you're a professor and you're honored at the same level as a doctor or a successful lawyer in this country. I mean, oh my gosh, when we went to live in Paris, my daughter and I, and she started in the 6th grade, she started mathematics and they were already doing geometry in the 6th grade. So it was quite traumatic.
His issue is actually more of identity. It's the particularity of American capitalism, which treats ethnic identities as a kind of vector of hyper-communitarianism, as opposed to this sort of laïcité, open space, open identification, universal French identification, which
Right.
sees itself in a Rousseauist way of sort of transcending these petty particularisms, right?
Right.
It sees itself as the cosmopolitan instantiation. So the American identity politics is a threat. And it's ironic that Macron would say that because he's the centrist, and this is the ideology of centrism. So
Yes.
it's an obvious ploy to the right wing of the French political spectrum, I think. Anyways,
Interesting.
Dwayne has a question, which is, he says, what do you think about a clinic of addictions?
Clinic of addictions.
Yeah, sorry, it's just a really simple question because you were saying that, if I understood you correctly, Ellie, nice to see you, by the way, that perhaps the capitalist discourse doesn't have a central place within the clinic. And I was wondering if a clinic of addictions, which we see more and more of, I know a few years ago, there was a really popular anthology, a Lacanian anthology on addictions, for example. I wonder if you see the capitalist discourse as speaking to that in any particular way, and if so, in what particular ways can it provide some coordinates?
I think that's a very good question. They do work in Paris or in all the other countries that are following them. They have a group that works on alcoholism, a group that works on drug addiction. They work in the regular clinic on sexual addiction. So they very much pay attention. For example, they say that some psychotics, one of the symptoms that you can tell, or I'm sorry, not psychotics, alcoholics, is they have a poverty of fantasy life, that somehow they didn't get enough attention or enough identifications with the world to have much of a fantasy life, and they try to cover that up with alcoholism. So I think that probably I think that people who are I think that people who are really taken up by the capitalist discourse, I'm just thinking of the people I know and people in my family, they would be absolutely outraged if you suggested that they need to go or might benefit from going to psychoanalysis. I mean, they see themselves as having arrived. My brother, who built a luxury mansion in the Blue Ridge Mountains, I mean, he would be horrified if you suggested that he has his suffering too. For him, it's what you do with your goods.
Isn't like what Peter was saying about ordinary psychosis, isn't the very shift in the psychotic structure of our time to an ordinary, isn't that an effect of the discourse of capitalism dominance? So we're framing it as like an individual would be operating like that. Is that really the right way to frame it? You know what I mean? Isn't it more that this is a structuring effect?
I mean, that's the culture we grew up in. I mean, even the poorest of people believe that, what are we talking about now? And I agree with it, that we're going to give money to people who are poor during this COVID period. And, you know, I mean, we have to do that. But it's not so that they can go out and buy some goods. It's so they can buy food. It just basically exists.
It also artificially happens, of course. We've got an entire country of essentially young people all on speed, very much to Dwayne Russell's point, you know, which essentially cuts off the unconscious. And because why would you want to deal with the unconscious? It's a big mess. I think the clinic of addiction is, you know, very relevant, because what is addiction? It's, you know, it bypasses. How do they put it? It bypasses the other, you know, directly to jouissance. It deproblematizes the other. It allows you to be hooked to capitalism. I mean, so, but it's a very conservative answer, of course, the treatment, in one sense, that people don't want to hear, you know.
Right. I remember when we first went to Paris a few years ago, me and some of my students, we went and spent a couple of years there, and immediately a couple of the students said, well, I don't need psychoanalysis because I take drugs and they do for me what psychoanalysis would. And so they began their education by talking to their analysts about why drugs, the effect of drugs is not the same thing as the effect of psychoanalysis. I mean, they wanted to believe, you know, that the drugs did them good and made them feel better. And so why would they need psychoanalysis? I mean, repetition, obviously.
Right. Interesting.
So medication becomes another symptom that you're taking in. It's the source. It becomes the source of the problem,
Right.
rather than.
Right.
Or it gets rid of symptoms and gets rid of enjoyment in the long run for the same reason.
Right. Exactly. Yes. I mean, one thing that does happen when you go through a psychoanalysis is that you do have more access to jouissance in the positive way and more access to creativity. It helps.
Interesting. Thomas Savolos, who's with Miller's school.
Yes.
New book. Well, he has another book coming up, but in his last book, he has a whole chapter which is brilliant on drug addiction in the clinic, and it's called 21st Century Psychoanalysis. Highly recommend his work.
That's why he went to Miller rather than Fink, because he said he couldn't get any way to work in the clinic through Fink's teaching. And through Miller, he learned how to work with drug addicts. Because being chief of psychiatry, he sees a lot of the.
Yeah, I mean, before COVID-19, the opioid epidemic, which is an invisible and almost a silent epidemic of death, is there's no institutions that represent those people suffering, and the social services of the state also only respond to them as a crisis, last ditch, but there's no preventative mechanisms to assist that suffering. So in that sense, you know, like after the First World War, and Freud adopted the notion of the free clinics all throughout, it's something like that should happen again. And if it did, and it was under the auspices of a Lacanian direction, it probably would be one of the best things for the longevity of Lacanianism in America. And that you don't have to invoke some communist ideology to talk about that.
Right.
You know, it's different.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Although, of course, so many Lacanian analysts have a background as Marxists or Maoists. You know, I mean, psychoanalysis leans left. Probably always has, which is why we're interested.
Absolutely. Well, I'm tempted to close here unless there's a final thought, comment, question.
I was just saying one thing to Peter. When I said we go that way one by one, I meant that each person's experience of their symptom is singular. So
Right.
you can't make any, all obsessionals are, all hysterics are, there's no universality of how the symptom is going to affect each one.
On Thursday, in a couple of days, we have another meeting that I invite everyone to join. It's from a scholar called Clyde Barrow in Texas, and it's actually on Marxism. And he is making the argument that the best way to analyze Trumpism is as a coalition of a lumpen proletariat coalition. He has a book that just came out, which is an exhaustive study of the etymology of the history from Marx all the way to Fanon to the Black Panthers on the lumpen proletariat, and shows how the Black Panthers predicted Trumpism as what would happen to the white proletariat once they're kicked out of their relationship to production. And it's a brilliant analysis. It's one that's, is brilliant because it really makes a lot of powerful people upset to frame Trumpism in this way. But I think it's the correct way to frame it. So if nothing else, come for the debate Thursday night. It's free. Just send me a message if you'd like to come.
Okay.
And Ellie, you're more than welcome to come too. You can brush up on your Marxism with us, Renegade.
I need to do that. Especially if I'm going to speak about Marx, utter his name, I need to know something.
All the best. Thanks, Duane. Thanks, Ellie, Robert, Peter, Kayam, Macario, everyone that came, Sean, Frank. We'll see you next time.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ellie.
Good night, everyone.